In the year when kings rose and fell as swiftly as tides, Theon Greyjoy stood at Robb Stark's side in the Great Hall of Riverrun, where the new king in the north planned his next moves against House Lannister. Theon, son of Balon Greyjoy, had been taken as a ward by Eddard Stark many years before, but rather than turn cloak, he chose to stay loyal to the family that had raised him, binding himself to House Stark's cause in the bitter conflict that divided the realm. While distant horns sounded, and knights polished their armor, Theon lingered near Robb and his trusted companions, the swirl of war strategies enveloping him in a whirlwind of possibility and peril. Though the dark memory of his father's rebellion haunted him, he resolved he would not repay House Stark's kindness with treachery. Instead, he sought to become a linchpin between two worlds, the Iron Islands and the North. He recalled the moment when Robb had confided in him the desperate need for allies. The Lannisters had seized control of King's Landing, the Baratheons were tearing themselves asunder, and Renly and Stannis each claimed the Iron Throne. To secure the North's independence and also avenge the death of Lord Eddard Stark, Robb needed more ships and men. Theon knew that Balon Greyjoy had always yearned for an independent Iron Islands, free of the yoke of any other kingdom. His father had once launched a rebellion to gain that freedom, only to be crushed by Ned Stark and King Robert. Theon knew that if Balon was approached properly, and if the right compromises were made, it was possible the Ironborn might rise again, this time as a powerful ally to the Starks rather than as an enemy. It would not be easy. Theon had learned enough of his father's way to recognize that proud old Balon Greyjoy believed any alliance was a sign of weakness. But at that moment, Theon believed that, if he could present the right offer, a promise that under King Robb Stark the Ironborn could keep their ways, could plunder and raid their enemies' coasts, and could have a place of honor in the New North, perhaps Balon would bend. Theon weighed his own conscience. He wondered if that was truly the right thing for the Iron Islands. The old ways were brutal. Salt wives, raids, the drowned god demanding violence, and the iron price. Theon himself had grown to appreciate the sense of justice that Ned Stark had instilled in him. Yet, for the sake of the war, for the sake of the North's survival, he believed forging this alliance was the only path forward. Thus, when Robb Stark asked for volunteers to parley with Balon, Theon stepped forward. "I know my father," he said, voice loud and resolute. "He may not be the man you expect, but let me try to reason with him. I owe it to you and to Ned Stark, who cared for me when I was but a hostage. Let me show you that I can bring the Iron Islands to your cause." Robb and his bannermen exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Theon's father was a dangerous man. But Robb also knew how crucial ships would be if they were to stand a chance against the Lannisters, and even more so, if they were to have hope of bringing the conflict to the southern coasts. "Then go with my blessing," Robb finally said. "But do not forget who we are. Do not forget the honor my father taught us. If your father offers terms, I will consider them, but we will not allow pillaging of the innocent. We will not stand aside to watch the Ironborn wreak havoc on the Riverlands without cause. There must be some balance between the old ways of your people and the new order we mean to establish." So it was decided. Before Theon departed, Robb placed a hand on Theon's shoulder, an unspoken trust passing between them. Theon bowed his head, prayed to the old gods that he would not be forced to choose between blood and bonds, and set off for Pike. Pike had not changed much in his absence. Its towers of dark stone rose from the sea-swept rocks, bridges of rope and wood swayed precariously in the harsh winds, and the great keep itself stood brooding and cold. Theon approached, memory swirling in his mind of the day he had last left these shores as a youth, a ward taken as a prize. He remembered that he had felt a quiet relief leaving these bleak battlements for the far friendlier fortress of Winterfell. Yet now he found himself at the threshold once again, uncertain how he would be received. He was forced to wait. The Ironborn lacked the hospitality he had grown used to in the north. Food and warmth were scarce, and his father had not summoned him immediately. Finally, a gaunt man in a salt-stained cloak escorted him to Balon Greyjoy's presence. The great hall of Pike smelled of brine and old smoke, the voices of men echoing off the stone walls. There, on a driftwood throne carved with tentacles that spiraled outward, sat Balon. His hair was still as dark and windswept as Theon remembered, though streaked now with threads of silver. His eyes, cold and unyielding, measured Theon with quiet intensity. "You return to me at last," Balon said, voice flat. "Ward of Winterfell, have you learned the ways of the Starks so thoroughly that you have forgotten the sea?" Theon bowed his head. He was careful, for he knew each word mattered. "I am no Stark," he said, though it pained him slightly to speak that truth. "I am your son, returned to the Iron Islands to prove my worth. I have come with an offer, father." Balon did not invite him closer. "Speak it." Theon proceeded to explain the situation. That Robb Stark, the newly declared king in the north, had launched a rebellion against the Iron Throne after the execution of Lord Eddard. That war consumed the land, with the north forging its own kingdom, the Riverlands allied under King Robb's banner, and the Lannisters pressing from the west. He spoke of Robb's victories, the battles at the Whispering Wood and the capture of Jaime Lannister. He emphasized the precarious situation the Lannisters now faced, the rebellious Baratheons in the south, and how the Greyjoys might stand to gain if they allied with Robb at this critical moment. "You speak of alliances," Balon said, scorn evident on his weathered face. "That is the Kneelers' talk. I remember well how my rebellion ended. And you think the wolf pup will treat me any better than his father did?" "He is not Ned Stark, father," Theon said calmly. "He respects strength, but he is still young. He needs your ships. The Lannisters are cunning and well-armed. If the king in the north were to lend you lands or privileges that the Ironborn have long sought, would you not consider it? We can carve our own place in a world the Lannisters have sought to dominate." Balon's laugh was humorless, echoing off the cold walls. "I have ships enough to raid the coasts of the Westerlands if I wish. I need no boy wolf to tell me who my enemies are." Theon drew a measured breath. "But you could have more," he ventured. "Robb Stark wants to break from the Iron Throne forever. If you join him, you could be part of a new order where the Iron Islands are free. Robb is not the old king. He has no desire to keep you underfoot, not if you are fighting at his side." A silence stretched between them. Balon studied Theon's face, as though searching for signs of cowardice or duplicity. Theon held his ground, shoulders squared. At last, Balon spoke. "I shall consider it, but understand this. The Ironborn submit to no one without a price. If Robb Stark wants my ships, I want to see the gold flow. I want to see him grant us free reign to raid the Westerlands. And I want the old ways honored. That is something I can bring to him," Theon said, though he felt an uncomfortable knot form in his stomach. He knew Robb would not be eager to let the Ironborn pillage innocents. Still, there might be a middle ground. The Ironborn might focus their raids strictly on Lannister holdings, or on those who had allied with the Iron Throne. He thought to himself that such an arrangement might be possible. The next morning, Theon rode out on the causeway from Pike to broker the terms with Robb Stark. The journey was fraught with tension, for the Iron Islands were never a welcoming place. He left behind cold stares and half-spoken doubts. He knew that many among the Ironborn considered him a half-breed northerner, or worse, a traitor who had gone soft. But Theon remained resolute, believing that forging this alliance was his path to prove his worth both to his father and to the Starks. When he arrived back at Riverrun, Robb gathered his bannermen in the candlelit war room, the great carved table covered with maps of the Seven Kingdoms. Theon presented Balon's demands. The men around Robb erupted in protest at the mention of giving the Ironborn free rein to raid Lannister coasts. They saw it as monstrous and dishonorable. Yet Theon insisted that Balon would not join them without a price. He offered a plan. They would let the Ironborn harass only Lannister territories, focusing on supply lines and outlying castles loyal to the Lions. By doing so, they would weaken the Lannisters and force them to divert troops westward. Meanwhile, the Northern Army could push further south or even maneuver into the strategically important Twins to keep the frays in check. Robb deliberated with his advisors. Roose Bolton, ever calculating, pointed out that such an alliance might be beneficial tactically. The Lannisters would be fighting on two fronts, letting the northern host gain a more secure foothold in the Riverlands. The Blackfish, Catelyn Stark's uncle, was uneasy about trusting Balon Greyjoy. But at Robb's side, Catelyn quietly considered the bigger picture. "We have seen how formidable Tywin Lannister can be," she murmured. "We must consider every advantage." At length, Robb turned to Theon. "I am no tyrant," he said, "but I will not countenance wanton slaughter. If Balon will keep his raids confined to Lannister strongholds and harbors only, then I will grant him the spoils from those raids. In return, he must swear loyalty to the king in the north and supply ships whenever we have need of them. If he cannot accept those terms, we will look elsewhere for allies." Though it was not exactly what Balon had demanded, Theon believed it was workable. He returned to Pike, braving the harsh seas once more, and relayed these conditions. The old man scoffed, but Theon could see the gleam in Balon's eyes at the thought of Lannister gold and glory. "Then so be it," Balon said, motioning for an iron-born scribe to record the terms. "I will pledge my krakens to the wolf's cause, so long as I may take what is rightfully mine from Tywin Lannister's domain." Thus, a tenuous alliance was born. Theon prayed it would hold. He served as the messenger, traveling between Robb and Pike to ensure that both sides kept their word. Soon the Iron Fleet, under the command of Theon Greyjoy, sailed forth from the Iron Islands and began harrying the western coasts of the Westerlands. Villages loyal to the Lannisters burned, small garrisons fell, and Lannister supply ships were seized or destroyed. Tywin Lannister found himself forced to dispatch forces west, away from the main theaters of war in the Riverlands. Meanwhile, Robb Stark marched his armies more securely in the Riverlands, forging alliances with House Tully and House Mallister, pressing advantage where he could. Theon stayed primarily at Robb's side. The other lords in Robb's camp eyed him warily, wondering if the Greyjoy boy could truly be trusted. But day by day, Theon earned a measure of respect. He fought fiercely in skirmishes along the fords, an axe in one hand and a sword in the other. His knowledge of coastal tactics helped Robb plan certain maneuvers to confound the Lannisters. Slowly, he rose in stature, no longer just the ward of Eddard Stark, but an essential officer in Robb's court. It was during these days that a raven arrived from King's Landing, bearing news that shocked the realm. King Joffrey, the Boy King, had apparently offended House Tyrell in some public spectacle. The details were unclear, but rumors said the Tyrells had turned against the Lannisters, forging an alliance with Renly Baratheon instead. Whether it was true or not, the effect on Tywin's strategy was immediate. He had to reinforce King's Landing in case the Tyrells marched north. This further spread Lannister forces thin. Robb saw the opening, and Theon watched as the king in the north seized the moment. Robb led a daring raid across the Red Fork, capturing several key Lannister bannermen. Jaime Lannister had already been a captive, and now the loss of more high-ranking knights dealt a blow to Tywin's morale. The war ground on, as all wars do, with bursts of violence and long stretches of uncertainty. But it seemed that the North was winning more than it was losing. It was a strange feeling for Theon, who remembered hearing tales of the Mad King's defeat, Robert's rebellion, and the Iron Throne's near absolute power. Yet here he stood, watching an upstart young king from Winterfell dismantle the Lannister hold with cunning and alliances. Word reached them that Balon Greyjoy's raids were particularly brutal along the coast, to the point that some smaller houses in the Westerlands begged for mercy or threatened to align with House Martell or House Tyrell out of desperation. Robb sent ravens reminding Balon of the arrangement. Do not overstep, do not burn towns needlessly. Yet it was unclear whether Balon heeded these warnings. The Ironborn thrived on violence, and old hatreds ran deep. Though Theon disliked hearing the stories of cruelty, he understood that his father would never temper the Ironborn thirst for reaving entirely. All he could do was pray that Balon did not do anything so atrocious that it would drive Robb to break the alliance. Nevertheless, the alliance endured, perhaps more from mutual necessity than respect. The North needed ships, and the Ironborn needed gold and plunder. Together, they were damaging the Lannisters enough that Tywin Lannister had to contend with crises on multiple fronts. That was the reality of the War of the Five Kings. Alliances formed and dissolved based on advantage. In that swirling chaos, Theon Greyjoy remained that singular hinge, bridging the deep sea with the cold north. Yet Theon had not forgotten Winterfell, or the warm presence of Robb's younger brothers, or the memory of Lady Catelyn's watchful gaze. It weighed on him that he had turned his back on them for this new path. But had he really turned his back? No. He served House Stark's cause. He fought for the freedom of the North. By refusing to betray Robb, Theon believed he upheld a debt of honor to Eddard Stark. Still, the lines between his loyalties were complicated. He was an Ironborn among Northerners, and a Northerner among the Ironborn. As the war progressed, Robb recognized the need to formalize the alliance with the Iron Islands. He needed to ensure that once the dust settled, the Ironborn would not simply turn their weapons on the North next. So a meeting was set. Robb Stark would ride to Seagard, accompanied by a retinue, to speak with Balon Greyjoy and formalize a treaty. Theon accompanied him, anxious about what might happen if tensions flared. Seagard was a battered coastal stronghold, still recovering from the last time the Ironborn had raided it many years ago. Lord Jason Mallister, who held Seagard, had opened his gates reluctantly at Robb's command. Though he harbored old grudges against the Greyjoys, Mallister bowed to the king in the North's wishes. Tents were pitched outside the castle walls, the Stark banners snapping in the sea wind next to the Kraken sigils of House Greyjoy. Balon arrived on his flagship, the Black Wind, along with his daughter Yara Greyjoy and a cadre of Ironborn captains. Their presence sent unease through the Northerners, who recalled the savage reputation of those who followed the drowned god. Yet, for one day at least, they attempted to keep the peace. Robb and Balon greeted each other in the castle yard, the chill wind tangling their cloaks. Balon gave Robb a once-over, a disdainful smirk tugging at his lips, but he said nothing overtly disrespectful. Robb, for his part, greeted Balon with guarded politeness, flanked by several of his bannermen and the Great John, who seemed eager to break heads if the parley went sour. Theon stood at Robb's right, silently bridging the gap. Yara approached Theon, looking him up and down. She had teased him once before when he visited Pike, mocking him as little brother who went away to the wolves. But though her teasing manner was still there was also a grudging respect in her nod. They gathered in Seagard's great hall, the Mallister banners hung on the walls. Robb began by stating plainly the North's objectives: to remain free from the Iron Throne, to be recognized as an independent kingdom, and for its allies to be respected. Balon's demands, in turn, were recognition of the Iron Islands as sovereign from both the Iron Throne and the North, though the Greyjoys would remain friends and allies to King Robb. He wanted official license to raid Lannister territories as he saw fit, and to keep the spoils. He asked also for certain coastal holdings in the Westerlands as payment for services rendered. An uneasy hush fell. Robb's lords bristled at the brazen demands. But Theon, quietly, pointed out that the Westerlands were the Lannisters' seat of power, and if Tywin were crushed, those lands might be up for grabs. "If we defeat Tywin," Theon said in a steady voice, "there will be new lines drawn. Why not let the Ironborn hold certain castles, so long as they do not threaten the North?" Catelyn Stark, standing by her son, pressed her lips together in a tight frown, unsure about ceding any portion of the realm to the Ironborn. But she recognized how vital their ships and raids were. Ultimately, after much debate, they signed a compact. Balon would continue to harry the Lannisters and provide naval support to Robb as needed. In exchange, if the Lannisters were defeated, the Greyjoys would gain certain coastal enclaves once belonging to minor houses sworn to Casterly Rock, though specifically those that had proven themselves especially loyal to Tywin. It was a devil's bargain, one that set uneasy hearts pounding, but it cemented the North's alliance with Pike, at least on paper. With that, Balon Greyjoy departed, leaving behind a token force of longships for Robb's immediate use. As Theon watched the Iron Fleet vanish into the horizon, he caught Yara's eye from the deck of the Black Wind. She gave him a mocking salute as though to say, "You've bound us to the wolves, little brother. Let's see how this ends." Theon stood at the battlements, exhaling, wishing he could see some path to keep all parties content. Perhaps it was an impossible dream. The war wore on. Battles erupted across the Riverlands, and news arrived that Stannis Baratheon had defeated his brother Renly at Storm's End, while the Tyrells declared for King Joffrey, causing mass confusion in the south. Tywin Lannister, threatened in the west by the Ironborn raids, was forced to split his armies, trying to defend both King's Landing and Lannisport. Meanwhile, the North's host struck at Harrenhal, hoping to dislodge the Lannisters from that fortress. Each day brought new tidings of small victories or devastating losses. Theon fought in skirmishes, riding at the flank of the Northern Knights, leading Reavers in coastal raids against Lannister loyalists, balancing that precarious line between the old ways and the new. He found himself surprisingly respected by men who had once scorned him. The Great John barked with laughter when Theon boasted of the day he took a Lannister outpost with just a handful of Ironborn at his side. Roose Bolton watched Theon with those pale eyes, perhaps measuring how useful this alliance might be for his own ambitions. Catelyn Stark remained distant but civil, occasionally giving Theon a nod that spoke of gratitude for the advantage he had helped secure. Only Robb Stark treated him as something akin to a brother, frequently inviting him to counsel, hearing out his opinions, and trusting his word. But in quiet moments, Theon wrestled with the question of identity. He was a Greyjoy, but it was the Stark family who had shaped him. He found that he missed the simpler days in Winterfell, riding with Robb, teasing Sansa, or helping Bran with his bow. He recalled the fatherly advice Ned Stark had once given him, and he realized that he wanted, more than anything, to prove that Ned had been right to show him kindness. One chilly evening, as the northern host made camp near the twins, Theon ventured out to clear his head along the riverbank. He was surprised when Robb followed him, wearing a thick cloak to ward off the cold. "You look troubled," Robb said quietly, stepping beside him to gaze at the moonlit water. Theon let out a slow breath. "Sometimes I wonder if I've truly done the right thing," he admitted. "The Iron Islands are my birthright, but the North is my home. I feel caught between them." Robb nodded, the flickering campfires reflecting in his keen eyes. "I cannot claim to understand fully, Theon. My father taught me loyalty, that a man must keep his word. Yet we live in a world of shifting alliances, where lords break oaths as easily as snapping a twig. You have stood by me. For that, you have my thanks and my trust. Perhaps, someday, we can unite the Iron Islands and the North in a genuine peace." Theon gave a half-smile, the weight of the conflict pressing upon him. "Perhaps," he said softly, "if we win this war and if Balon keeps his word." In the months that followed, the war grew ever more complex. News came that a shadowy assassin had killed Renly Baratheon in his tent, spurring many of the Stormlords to declare for Stannis. King's Landing reeled from one crisis to another, with Joffrey's reign marred by cruelty and mismanagement. The arrival of the Tyrells in the capital gave the Lannisters new strength, but also new tensions. Meanwhile, the North, with the Iron Islands' help, continued to nibble away at the Lannister strongholds in the west. Balon Greyjoy seemed content with his raids, hauling back gold, captives, and glory to Pike. Yet Theon sensed that his father was growing restless, wanting an even greater prize. So it was not entirely surprising when Balon sent a raven to Robb, proposing a bold plan: an attack on Lannisport itself, the major harbor near Casterly Rock. If they could seize Lannisport, it would deal a crippling blow to House Lannister, cutting off much of their trade and ability to resupply. Balon offered the full might of the Iron Fleet for the assault, if Robb would commit a sizable force of Northerners to secure the city once taken. Robb convened a war council at Riverrun to discuss the plan. Some lords argued it was too risky. Lannisport was well defended, and even with the Lannisters stretched thin, they would not let their principal city fall easily. Others, like the Great John, found the idea thrilling, a chance to strike a decisive blow. Roose Bolton observed that capturing Lannisport might put Tywin on the back foot permanently, ensuring a swift victory. If the attack succeeded, the Lannisters would be all but broken in the west. Catelyn cautioned, "We must not forget the cost in lives. And what of the small folk in Lannisport? Are we prepared to subject them to an ironborn assault?" But Robb, as king, had to weigh all concerns. He turned to Theon, seeking his perspective. Theon admitted it was a grand gamble, But if it succeeded, House Lannister might not recover. With the Iron Fleet blockading the port, the North's armies pushing from the Riverlands, and the West Coast in chaos, Tywin's hold could crumble. After hours of debate, Robb decided to move forward with Balon's proposal. He demanded certain guarantees. No wholesale slaughter of civilians, no widespread pillaging. Balon must keep his men under control as best he could. Theon knew that would be a challenge, but he also knew that, if there was a chance to end the war more quickly, it lay in a bold stroke. Thus, the king in the north sent his reply to Pike. They would join the assault on Lannisport. Took weeks to prepare. Theon traveled to Pike once more, coordinating with Yara and Victarion. They planned a three-pronged attack. One force would strike the harbor from the sea, using longships to breach any defensive chain or blockade. Another force would land north of the city, circling around to cut off reinforcements. Meanwhile, Robb's troops would march from the Riverlands, forging a corridor through the Tumblestone to approach Lannisport from the southeast. It was a complicated maneuver requiring precise timing, but if done well, the Lannisters would be caught in a pincer. As Theon helped plan the assault, he couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. This was what he had wanted, to prove himself in a decisive campaign, to show that his loyalty to the Starks could bear fruit, and to see the Ironborn unleashed in a way that served a larger goal. At the same time, a shadow of doubt lingered in his mind, for he knew how easily the Ironborn thirst for plunder could spin out of control. He also thought of the small folk behind those walls. War was never kind, but Lannisport was a major city with thousands of residents. There would be collateral damage no matter how many pacts were made or how many times Robb insisted on limiting violence. Still, the war demanded boldness, and Theon pressed on. At last, the day arrived. Theon stood on the deck of one of the Ironborn longships, the spray of salt water on his face, the drums pounding a furious rhythm as the ships approached Lannisport at dawn. Smoke curled from the city's chimneys in the early light. The harbor was guarded by war galleys flying the Lannister Lion, but the Iron Fleet vastly outnumbered them. Within minutes, the crash of wood on wood, the cries of warriors, and the clang of steel on steel echoed across the bay. Fire arrows soared through the sky, setting sails alight. Theon shouted commands, his voice hoarse as he directed men to swarm the docks. Theon Greyjoy, a hulking figure with a dour expression, led the main assault on the waterfront. With axes and cutlasses, the Ironborn pressed forward, driving Lannister soldiers back into the streets. Meanwhile, Theon saw sails on the horizon, more Kraken banners heading north to land a force behind the city. If all went to plan, Robb Stark's army would appear on the hills southeast of Lannisport by midday, sealing the fate of the defenders. Chaos reigned in the harbor. Smoke rose from burning ships, the acrid stench of pitch filling Theon's lungs. He leapt from the deck onto the wharf, sword in hand, parrying a Lannister soldier's desperate thrust. The soldier's eyes were wide with terror. Theon took him down swiftly, more from muscle memory than malice. Overhead, gulls circled, shrieking as though they, too, fed on the carnage. Theon pressed on, rallying those Ironborn who looked to him for direction. Despite his years in the north, many recognized him as Balon's son, and so they followed his lead, hacking through the Lannister lines. Shouts and screams echoed against stone warehouses. Dockworkers fled in terror as the Ironborn claimed the wharf. Theon caught sight of Yara, her blade slick with blood, urging her men forward. Theon felt a surge of relief that they were making steady progress. If the city fell quickly, there would be less slaughter. As he led a contingent deeper into the city's winding streets, he encountered pockets of resistance. Lannister archers fired from rooftops. Civilians cowered behind barrels. The stench of fear hung thick in the air. Hours passed like a storm, the city's defenders slowly retreating to the western gate, hoping to regroup. But Robb Stark arrived exactly when Theon hoped he would, banners fluttering behind him as the northern infantry poured in from the east, cutting off escape. Trapped, the Lannister forces fought a desperate last stand near the city's central square. Theon found himself face to face with men he once might have considered formidable. knights in gilded lion-crested armor. But the tide of battle was clearly against them. The square erupted in a swirl of violence, with Ironborn, Northerners, and Lannisters colliding in a deadly melee. Standing on a pile of rubble, Theon spied Robb Stark cutting through enemy ranks with the swiftness of a seasoned warrior. Nearby, the Great John bellowed with laughter as he hewed at Lannister spearmen. Smoke and ash rained down from rooftops set ablaze in the fighting. The city echoed with the clang of steel, the wailing of the wounded, and the roar of flames. Yet the coordination between the Ironborn and the Northerners proved too much for the city's defenders. One by one, the red-cloaked Lannisters dropped their weapons or fell, and soon the square was theirs. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Lannisport lay under the combined banner of the Wolf and the Kraken. Fires still burned in pockets, and looters scrambled through the streets. Theon hastened to do what he could to uphold Robb's demands for discipline, ordering men to round up Lannister captives rather than butcher them. Some Ironborn ignored these commands, seizing what they could, but Theon's presence, and that of Yara, who recognized the importance of following Balon's orders, kept the worst of the atrocities in check. Robb and his bannermen established a makeshift command post in the main keep of the city. In the aftermath, the weight of what they had done settled on Theon. Yes, they had taken Lannisport. Yes, it was a massive blow to House Lannister, and it would likely tilt the war in Robb's favor. But the toll had been high, and the havoc they had unleashed would not be easily undone. Still, Robb Stark clasped Theon's arm in gratitude, acknowledging the crucial role the Greyjoys had played. That night, in the keep that once housed Lannister administrators, Robb Stark was declared victorious in the West, cheered by Northerners and Ironborn alike. The war was not over, but this triumph shone bright in a realm darkened by death. Word spread like wildfire. Lannisport had fallen to the combined forces of the North and the Iron Islands. Tywin Lannister, furious and desperate, retreated to Casterly Rock to fortify his stronghold. King Joffrey in King's Landing raged, demanding that Tywin protect the western lands. But the rumors swirling through the realm suggested that Tywin's hold on the west was slipping. Gold shipments could no longer travel freely, and the fearsome Lannister name no longer held the same terror. Many smaller houses began to reconsider their allegiances, some even sending envoys to Riverrun or to Lannisport to treat with King Robb. All of this made Theon feel a heady mix of pride and anxiety. Pride that he had been part of so significant a victory, and anxiety that the cost of that alliance might continue to rise. For what exactly would Balon demand next? And how would this war end for the North, for the Iron Islands, and for himself? Amid the celebrations, Yara approached Theon in the newly claimed Lannisport keep. She had a half-grin on her face as she appraised him in a torchlit corridor. "Little brother, you've done well," she said. "Father will be pleased. But let's not forget who we are. We are Ironborn, and we have spilled blood to take this city. If the Wolf King dares to betray us, we will do what we must." Theon nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Robb won't betray us," he insisted. "He's an honorable man." But Yara merely shrugged, giving no outward sign of agreement or disagreement. She left him there, alone in the flickering shadows, the tension of divided loyalties ever present. Soon after, Balon Greyjoy himself sailed into Lannisport, claiming part of the city's harbor as his own. He toured the ruined streets, no doubt measuring the spoils. In a grand hall, Balon and Robb met once more to discuss the next moves in the war. Tywin Lannister remained at Casterly Rock, battered but unbroken. If they wished to end the war entirely, they would need to either take the rock or force Tywin into surrender. Balon, with the arrogance of a victorious commander, proposed a naval siege on Casterly Rock while the North assaulted by land. The fortress was perched on a colossal rock overlooking the Sunset Sea, near impossible to storm if the defenders knew an attack was coming. But if they could blockade the sea entrances and assault from multiple angles, perhaps the unthinkable was possible. Robb considered the plan. Theon could see the question in his eyes. How many more lives would be spent to break the Lannisters forever? But Theon also knew that, if they left Tywin in place, he would undoubtedly rebuild his power. so Theon spoke in favor of pressing the advantage. "We cannot let up, your grace," Theon said. "If we do not strike now, Tywin will dig in and come back stronger." In the end, Robb agreed. Plans were set in motion for a coordinated assault on Casterly Rock. The northern host would march through the Westerlands, subjugating any remaining Lannister banners along the way, and arrive outside the fortress. Meanwhile, the Iron Fleet, bolstered by ships seized in Lannisport, would blockade the sea routes. It would be the final blow, or so they hoped. If Casterly Rock fell, the war in the west would be effectively won. Yet, as they prepared for this monumental undertaking, news arrived from the north that troubled Robb greatly. Winterfell stood vulnerable. With so many northern lords away, some unscrupulous factions, wildlings who had slipped south of the wall, or even unscrupulous houses, might see an opening to raid the heart of the north. Word came of roving bands of brigands near the neck. And, of course, there was always the unknown threat from beyond the wall. Robb turned to Theon, pressing him for advice. Theon recalled the longing he felt for Winterfell, the memory of its walls and the sense of home it gave him. He suggested dispatching a small force back north to reinforce the castle. He even volunteered to lead it, if Robb thought that wise, for he knew the north as well as any. But Robb needed Theon's presence in the Westerlands, trusting him to coordinate with Balon. Thus, another solution was found. The Karstarks and the Glovers would send men to Winterfell, aided by the Umbers, ensuring the seat of House Stark remained secure. Theon felt a pang of relief, but also a swirl of guilt at not being able to return. He hoped Bran and Rickon were well, that they had the guidance of Maester Luwin and Ser Roderick to protect them. As the war moved inexorably forward, Theon found himself riding beside Robb's host through the Westerlands. They passed burned fields and deserted villages, evidence of the chaos wrought by both the Ironborn raids and the northern advance. In some places, peasants cowered in the woods, terrified of all armed men. Theon tried not to dwell on these grim realities, reminding himself that wars are never clean or merciful. He reminded himself that he was doing this to preserve a future for the North, and perhaps for the Iron Islands as well. There were battles, of course. The Northern Army clashed with Lannister loyalists along winding roads. Theon fought alongside Robb in a pitched confrontation near Ashmark, cutting down men who wore the Lion's sigil. His heart pounded with a fierce sense of purpose. At night, in the flickering glow of campfires, he remembered how differently things might have gone if he had betrayed Robb, if he had tried to seize Winterfell for Balon. That scenario haunted him, the knowledge that in the real timeline of events, Theon Greyjoy had indeed marched on Winterfell. But here, in this story he now lived, he had chosen loyalty. He felt a weight in that choice, knowing that each day it changed not just his fate but the fate of countless others. The day came when Robb's army stood at the foot of Casterly Rock, gazing up at the looming edifice carved into the cliff. The castle was as grand and intimidating as the tales said, with sheer walls of stone and cunningly placed defenses. High above, the Lannister banners still flew. Theon could almost feel Tywin's eyes bearing down on them from within those walls. It was near impossible to simply breach the rock by conventional siege. The fortress was built to withstand far larger armies than Robb's. But the Iron Fleet had blockaded the sea, and the Lannisters, cut off from supplies, could not hold out indefinitely. Still, a siege could take months, even a year, and Tywin might have allies or cunning plans yet to be revealed. Each day, Robb's captains and Balon's captains convened to discuss how to force a faster conclusion. Ironborn scouts reported that there were secret sea tunnels leading to the rock, tunnels that might be used to smuggle men in or out if they could be found and seized. On the 6th day of the siege, Theon led a small group of Northerners and Ironborn to search the rocky coastline, seeking any hidden entrance. The waves crashed violently against jagged rocks, making the climb treacherous. But at last, Theon spotted what looked like a narrow gap at low tide. He took a handful of volunteers, men both from the north and the Iron Islands, and ventured in at dusk, armed with torches and short blades for close-quarters fighting. The cavern stank of rotting seaweed, and the walls dripped with moisture. They advanced slowly, hearts pounding, until they came upon a wooden door battered by the tide. Forcing it open, they found a small tunnel leading upward. Foot by cautious foot, they moved deeper into the rock, the torchlight flickering against damp stone. At intervals, they heard voices echoing from somewhere above. Lannister guards, presumably, or hidden watchers. Carefully, they advanced, knives drawn. They emerged in a dimly lit corridor, confronting two startled Lannister guards. One guard tried to raise an alarm, but Theon's men subdued them swiftly. The guards had not expected an incursion from below, and the element of surprise was total. Pressing onward, Theon's group found themselves in the lower levels of Casterly Rock, near storerooms stacked with dwindling supplies. He sent one man back to inform Robb and Balon of the discovered route, while he and the others pressed deeper, ensuring the path was clear. They skirmished with more Lannister defenders in the labyrinthine corridors, the clash of steel echoing through stone halls. The fighting was tight and brutal, with torches sometimes knocked from hands, plunging them into darkness. Theon felt a surge of adrenaline as he ducked a sword thrust, burying his own blade into a guard's side. A strangled cry echoed, and Theon yanked his blade free. He forced himself not to flinch at the sight of blood. War demanded this. Eventually, they reached a heavy iron gate that blocked their path. Theon's men hammered at it, but it was barred from the other side. "We'll hold here," Theon gasped, sweat dripping from his brow. "When Robb arrives with reinforcements, we can force the gate and open a path." Indeed, not an hour later, reinforcements arrived through the tunnel, bearing crowbars, grapnels, and more men. They pried the gate open with a squeal of metal, pressing onward. By dawn, Robb Stark himself led a larger contingent into the lower halls of Casterly Rock, exploiting the gap Theon had opened. The fortress that had stood inviolate for centuries was now compromised from below. Shouts rang out through the corridors as Lannister men tried to rally, but with enemies inside the walls, panic spread. Bit by bit, the northern host and the Ironborn advanced, capturing storerooms, stairwells, and courtyards. The defenders, though fierce, were outmaneuvered. Tywin Lannister, in one last gambit, tried to rally his knights in the main courtyard, but the combined forces of Robb and Balon poured in from multiple angles. Theon charged into the fray, side by side with the Greatjon and other stalwart warriors. Clashing steel set the air ringing. Tywin himself, clad in ornate armor, looked fearsome as he slashed through an Ironborn captain. But soon he was surrounded, forced to surrender or face certain death. Robb Stark, battered and blood-streaked, confronted Tywin in that courtyard. A hush fell as the Lannister patriarch, who had loomed so large in the realm, knelt in grudging submission, his lion helm held at his side. Robb took Tywin's sword, passing it to one of his guards. The war in the west was won. In the aftermath, Theon Greyjoy stood on a balcony overlooking the sea, the Kraken banner fluttering beside the Stark direwolf above the mighty heights of Casterly Rock. Below, ships dotted the bay, and the city of Lannisport lay in their hands. He felt a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. So much death, so much bloodshed. Yet they had achieved the unimaginable. They had broken House Lannister's power in the west. For Balon, this was a moment to savor. The old man roamed the grand halls of the Rock, eyeing the gold-laden corridors with a hungry gaze, already speaking of what spoils might be claimed by right of conquest. For Robb, it was a solemn victory, tempered by the knowledge that many more battles still raged across the realm. Stannis Baratheon pressed his claim to the throne in the south. King Joffrey clung to King's Landing with the backing of the Tyrells, and the north itself faced whatever threats came with winter. In the days that followed, formal surrenders were signed. Tywin, forced to relinquish control, was held as a hostage, just as Jaime had once been. Many of the Lannister bannermen, seeing no hope of rescue, bent the knee to King Robb. Balon Greyjoy demanded, and received, official recognition that certain coastal territories in the Westerlands would be under Ironborn control. Theon felt uneasy about it, recalling that these territories had once belonged to small houses now scattered or destroyed. But war, as always, redrew the maps in blood. Amid the negotiations, Robb declared that House Lannister's gold mines were to be kept under northern oversight, ensuring that the new king in the north could fund the reconstruction of ravaged territories. Balon accepted some share of the spoils, though he grumbled at any attempts to limit the Ironborn's plundering. Theon sensed that eventually, friction might boil over again. But for the moment, they were united in victory. At a grand feast held in the Rock's Great Hall, an irony in itself, celebrating in the seat of their defeated enemy, Theon stood by Robb's side as lords and captains toasted the king in the north and the lord of the Iron Islands. Bowls of stew and flagons of ale were passed, weary men laughed or wept with relief, and minstrels played tunes that tried to lift heavy hearts. Theon sipped his drink, scanning the crowd. He spotted Yara, playing cards with some newly minted lord from the north, and Balon, engaged in a heated discussion with one of Robb's counselors. The flickering torches cast dancing shadows across stone walls emblazoned with Lannister sigils, now torn or covered by Starks and Greyjoy banners. Eventually, Robb rose, calling for the hall's attention. "We have won a great victory," he began. "But let us not forget that the realm is still in turmoil. My father's memory spurs me on to see justice done across the land. We have broken House Lannister's grip here, but I will not forget that King's Landing yet stands, with a false king on the throne. Nor will I abandon the north to any foes who might threaten it. We stand at a crossroads, my friends. We may continue this war until the Iron Throne is broken, or we may seek a peace that acknowledges our independence. Either path will be fraught with peril." There was a roar of voices in response, some calling for marching on King's Landing, others insisting it was time to fortify the north and let the south rot. Balon, for his part, made it clear he had no love for any king who would try to curb the Ironborn's thirst for freedom. Theon stood quietly, listening, feeling that the next chapter was looming. In the nights that followed, Theon wrestled with a sense of emptiness. He had achieved so much, helped orchestrate the downfall of the Lannisters in the west, yet he was no closer to feeling at peace with himself. The war was not truly over, and his place in the scheme of things remained uncertain. He had proven his loyalty to the Starks, had strengthened the bond with the Iron Islands, but new tensions arose daily. Some Northerners grew resentful of the Ironborn presence in the newly conquered lands. The Ironborn, in turn, chafed at any attempts to restrain their pillaging. One day, Robb summoned Theon to his quarters. The king in the north stood by an open window, gazing out at the sea, his direwolf, Grey Wind, lying at his feet. Robb's face was lined with fatigue, but he managed a faint smile as Theon entered. "I trust you're well?" he asked. "As well as one can be in these times," Theon replied, crossing the room. Robb nodded. "Balon wants to expand further along the coast, pressing into land that belonged to House Crakehall. My bannermen are concerned about letting the Ironborn run free. If I side with them, Balon might break the alliance or turn on us. It's a delicate balance, Theon, and I need your counsel. You know your father better than most." Theon clasped his hands behind his back, feeling the weight of the question. "Balon will keep pushing as long as he sees opportunity," he admitted. "He's never been one for half measures. You could try to reason with him, but to be frank, the only thing he respects is strength. If you stand firm, he might protest, but if you also offer him something else, perhaps the freedom to raid any Lannister loyalists outside those lands, he may relent." Robb's jaw tightened. War is a nasty business, but if we don't stand firm now, the Ironborn will keep taking more, and we'll have another rebellion on our hands in a year's time. Theon knew the truth of it. The North had gained a powerful ally, but also a volatile one. "Give him an outlet," Theon repeated quietly. "Don't trap him, but don't let him run rampant. That's the best you can do." Robb placed a hand on Theon's shoulder. "Thank you, my friend. You have done more for the North than I could ever have asked." Theon bowed his head, uncertain of what the future held. He could sense that the shaping of the realm was just beginning. The War of the Five Kings had taken a new turn, with the Lannisters broken in the west, but King's Landing still under Joffrey's rule, Stannis amassing power in the south, and the Tyrell alliance shifting like quicksand. Theon wondered if Daenerys Targaryen, the exiled queen rumored to have dragons in the east, would someday press her claim as well. The Game of Thrones never truly ended. Over the next months, Theon labored tirelessly to maintain the fragile alliance between House Stark and House Greyjoy. He mediated disputes over territory, oversaw the dividing of spoils, and worked alongside Robb's men to keep order in Lannisport. Meanwhile, ravens arrived daily with news from other corners of the war. Stannis' fleet destroyed at Blackwater Bay by wildfire, the Tyrells firmly entrenched in the capital, the Night's Watch calling urgently for help against the wildlings and darker threats beyond the wall. The realm was a patchwork of crises. Despite the chaos, Theon found moments of quiet. Sometimes, he would walk along the high battlements of Casterly Rock at dawn, watching the sun rise over the sea, thinking of Pike and the basalt towers that once seemed so daunting. Other times, he would remember Winterfell's godswood, the old weirwood tree with its face carved in the bark, the hush of the leaves in the wind. He realized that no matter what alliances were forged, no matter how many battles were won, there would always be a piece of him that yearned for simpler days. In time, letters arrived from Winterfell. Bran wrote of how he managed the keep in Robb's absence, how Rickon grew wilder each day, how the direwolves roamed the grounds in watchful silence. Theon felt relief that they were safe. Another letter came from Ser Roderick, updating that the north was still secure despite scattered raids and rumors of wildlings crossing the wall. Theon took solace in these letters, a reminder that he had done right by Robb, by House Stark. He had kept Winterfell safe by not betraying them. Yet the war demanded more. On a crisp morning, Robb assembled his core lords and captains. "The time has come," he said, voice carrying across the great hall. "We cannot stay in the west forever, ruling over lands that do not know us. The Lannisters are broken here, and Tywin is our captive. If we linger, we risk everything unraveling in the north. I will leave a garrison behind to ensure that Balon Greyjoy does not overreach. The rest of us will return home to secure our borders. Once we have done that, we may look to King's Landing, or to forging a permanent peace if the Iron Throne will grant the North its freedom." There was grumbling, particularly from some who thought they should press on, conquer more territory. Others, especially those from the Riverlands, yearned to return to their families. Balon, upon hearing that Robb would leave a garrison, bristled at the notion of being policed by Northerners. Theon took it upon himself to calm his father. "It is to help hold the territory we seized," he argued. "Better to have some of Robb's men here so they can see how we govern. Then, if all goes well, they'll have no cause for complaint." Balon's grudging acceptance of this plan underscored the precariousness of the alliance. In truth, Theon knew that as soon as the war ended, the Greyjoys might once again test the North's patience. But that would be a matter for another day. For now, Robb needed to rally his banners back to Winterfell, to strengthen his hold on the North, and to address the pleas from the Night's Watch about the troubles beyond the wall. Thus, Robb Stark, king in the north, led the bulk of his host away from Casterly Rock. Catelyn Stark departed with him, along with many of the great northern lords. They left behind a carefully chosen garrison under the command of Lord Bolton's bastard, Ramsay Snow, to keep an eye on the Ironborn in Lannisport and at the Rock. Theon, however, chose to accompany Robb. Part of him wanted to stay in the west to ensure that the fragile peace held, but something deeper called him back to the north. "I want to see Winterfell again," he confessed to Robb. "I want to see Bran and Rickon, and show them I'm still the same Theon who grew up among them." Robb offered no objection, smiling in relief to have Theon at his side once more. So, as the northern banners rolled up and the supply wagons rattled out of the gates, Theon rode with them, heading back through the war-scarred Westerlands, then across the Riverlands. They passed the remnants of battles, scorched fields, and broken keeps. Theon felt the weight of the war's toll. Yet as they moved ever northward, the air turning crisper, he felt a strange sense of homecoming. At the Twins, they found Walder Frey bristling at the fact that the war had extended so far, that Robb had left so many men in the west. He griped about the Ironborn, about alliances unfulfilled, about betrothals unsettled. Robb placated him as best he could, promising the Freys certain concessions once the realm stabilized. Theon kept his peace, for dealing with Walder Frey required its own brand of diplomacy, one that tested even Catelyn Stark's patience. Nonetheless, they were permitted to cross, and the host continued on. Eventually, they crossed the neck and beheld the wide expanses of the north. Theon felt an odd flutter in his chest at the sight of those rolling hills and great forests. If someone had told him years ago that he would feel relief returning to the north, he might have laughed. Yet here he was, more anxious to reach Winterfell than perhaps even Robb himself. The knowledge that he had upheld his oath weighed on him like a shield, giving him a sense of vindication. He hadn't betrayed the Starks. He had remained true. The day they arrived at Winterfell was cold and clear. The gates opened, and Bran, perched on Hodder's shoulders, greeted Robb with a joyous smile. Rickon bounded forward, followed by the direwolves, who barked with recognition. Theon felt a lump in his throat when Bran's gaze landed on him. A mixture of surprise and delight flickered across the boy's face. Bran called his name, voice echoing in the courtyard. Theon stepped forward, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Bran," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You've grown." Bran grinned, though sorrow still lingered in his eyes. A sorrow that came from losing his father and from all the burdens placed on him. "So have you," Bran said. You're a knight now, or something like it?" Theon managed a half-laugh. "Something like it," he replied. "I've been fighting for your brother. For you. For the North." Bran nodded, genuine warmth radiating from his smile. Nearby, Rickon clung to Robb, the young boy grinning ear to ear, while gray wind sniffed around the courtyard, reacquainting himself with the old smells. The returning warriors dismounted, stable hands rushing forward to take their horses. Servants scrambled to prepare a feast for the king in the North's homecoming. That evening, in the great hall of Winterfell, torches glowed warmly against the familiar stone walls. Long tables groaned under the weight of venison, bread, and roasted vegetables. Theon sat near the head table, watching Robb greet familiar faces. Maester Luwin, Old Nan, even the blacksmith Mikken. Theon felt an ache of nostalgia as he recognized the sense of Winterfell's halls, the distant murmur of the hot springs beneath the floors, the unadorned simplicity that made the North what it was. He realized in that moment how differently everything might have turned out had he betrayed Robb. Had he seized Winterfell for his father's ambition, none of this homecoming would have happened. The war might have led to a Stark defeat or at least a crippling blow. He might have been despised by the very people who had once treated him with kindness. Yet here he was, sharing bread and salt with the sons of Ned Stark, welcomed not as an enemy but as an ally. The bond they had forged in childhood had been tested by the flames of war, and it had endured. Later, Robb stood to address the hall. His voice carried the weight of responsibility as he spoke of the journey that lay ahead. "The Lannisters are broken in the west," he said, "but they still hold King's Landing. The Ironborn are our allies for now, but we must remain vigilant. The Night's Watch has called for aid. We have enemies in the south and possibly in the far north. But we stand strong as we have for thousands of years. Winterfell stands. The North remembers." A cheer rose from the men and women gathered. Bran, with a proud smile, lifted a cup in salute. Theon, too, raised his cup, feeling a swell of emotion. For all the horrors of war, for all the brutality unleashed, here was something worth preserving. The stark words, "Winter is coming," echoed in his mind, reminding him that unity and loyalty were precious. When the feast ended, Theon wandered the courtyard, letting the chill night air clear his head. He passed the old archery range where he used to train with Robb. He remembered how sometimes he'd show off, hitting the target center as if to prove he was the best marksman. He walked near the Wolfswood Gate, recalling hunts and boyhood escapades. Everywhere he looked, memory collided with the reality of the war-scarred man he had become. He paused before the heart tree in the Godswood, the white bark glimmering beneath moonlight, the red leaves rustling softly. The carved face with its ancient eyes seemed to peer into his soul. Theon felt a lump in his throat. He remembered how Ned Stark would come here to pray, how the tradition of the old gods had once felt foreign to him. Now it felt like a link to a life that was simpler, a life he had nearly lost. He sank to his knees before the heart tree, resting his forehead against the ground. He did not know how to pray in the manner of the old gods, but he let his heart speak. He thought of Ned Stark, who had spared him, raised him, taught him. He thought of Balon Greyjoy, driven by pride and ambition. He thought of Robb, who had trusted him with the precarious alliance. He thought of the thousands of lives altered by this war, some ended before their time. He thought of Winterfell, a place that had shaped him more than Pike ever could. "Thank you," he whispered to whatever old power might be listening. He did not expect an answer, but the wind in the leaves seemed to stir, as though acknowledging his presence. Thus, Theon Greyjoy remained at Winterfell for a time, helping to oversee the reorganization of the northern defenses, ensuring the ravens flew to the far-flung lords, cautioning them to remain vigilant. The war was not done. The realm was far from stable. Yet in that moment of respite, it felt as though the North at least stood united. Theon often joined Bran at meals, hearing the boys' quiet musings about dreams of strange ravens and journeys. He joined Rickon in playful sword lessons, the young one too eager to spar. Each day, Theon felt more at home, though the specter of further conflict loomed on the horizon. Time pressed forward as it always does. Ravens came bearing tidings of King's Landing. Joffrey's reign continued, propped up by the Tyrells, while Stannis Baratheon claimed the Stormlands. The Ironborn presence in the Westerlands grew fractious, leading to reports of skirmishes between them and the few remaining Lannister loyalists. Robb debated whether to march south again or to fortify the north entirely. Meanwhile, rumors from the Wall grew more alarming. Wildling armies were on the move, and there were whispers of darker things stirring in the snowy wastes. Yet, in every conversation, Theon was included, his voice respected, his loyalty undisputed. And in that regard, everything had changed from what it might have been had he turned traitor. In quiet moments, Theon recognized this life he now led, however fraught with war's burdens and uneasy alliances, was a path of honor, one that honored the memory of Eddard Stark far more than any fleeting ambition to claim the North for Balon Greyjoy. Perhaps the day would come when the Iron Islands and the North stood together, truly at peace, their differences reconciled. Or perhaps that was just a dream. Still, Theon Greyjoy found solace in the knowledge that he had chosen differently. He had not betrayed the Starks. He had fought by Robb's side in the War of the Five Kings, forging an alliance that shattered House Lannister's hold on the west. He had seen Lannisport fall, witnessed the capture of Tywin Lannister, and returned to Winterfell not as a conqueror, but as a friend. Whatever the future held, he would face it with the Stark blood at his back, the Ironborn spirit in his veins, and the memory of that dire choice always burning in his mind. In the end, he realized, loyalty was not just a word but a choice made every day, one that defined his life more powerfully than any single battle ever could. And thus, Theon Greyjoy, the boy who once stood uncertainly between two worlds, now stood firmly beside the wolves, forging a tale of unity and honor in a realm too often torn by treachery and betrayal.